This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today I'm speaking with Vincent Cannato about our evolving immigration policy. Professor Cannato is an associate professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and he is the author of American Passage, The History of Ellis Island. He also is the author of The Ungovernable City, John Lindsay and His Struggle to Save New York. Professor Cannato, glad to have you.
Nice to be with you, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Great. Now, you wrote in an essay recently, Our Evolving Immigration Policy, that, and I thought it was a very well-stated thesis, America's immigration policy has always been determined by a larger notion of what Americans at any given time expect of the federal government. And so you kind of walk through some crucial episodes, late 19th century, particularly the last quarter of that century, what happens after World War I, and then also the New Deal and the Great Society period. And so as a way to kind of develop your thesis. But before we get into those crucial episodes of immigration, I want to kind of backtrack and think about the recent Supreme Court decision in 2012, the Arizona decision dealing with that state's attempt to, has it framed, it helped the federal government enforce its policies, and the Supreme Court, ruling that the federal government preempted in this policy subject and, really held the field on immigration, and Arizona needed to back down. But I want to ask you, for most of our nation's history, or rather most of the 19th century, who's doing most of the regulating when it comes to immigration policy, and by what principles?
Well, by the 1870s, up until the 1870s or 1880s, immigration is almost completely dominated and regulated by states. The federal government has next to nothing to do with the regulation of immigration. The one aspect of immigration that the federal government does deal with is naturalization, making people citizens, and that's kind of a natural nation-building purpose. But in terms of who comes in and who is not allowed to come in, it's really individual states that create laws. So Massachusetts has a law, New York has a law, Pennsylvania has a law governing who can come in and who can't.
So, and where would most of the immigration points have been during this time? Was it primarily, I think, mythical, New York, other parts?
Boston.
Yeah.
Sure, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. These are the major port cities, mostly of the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. That's really where you have people coming in relatively large numbers.
And so the states that are, as it were, forced or have to deal with immigration or want to deal with people moving in, what are the principles that really guide their policies?
It's sort of general. There are a few general principles. Concern with disease, obviously, not public health, so not allowing people in who have contagious diseases. And the other thing is the issue of paupers, or people who are not just poor, but kind of destitute or unable to take care of themselves. Those are kind of the two major themes running through these laws. And there's, and these are based on older laws as well, of, both in England and the United States, about regulating, people coming in who might be, I guess today we would probably say homeless people, or people who are incredibly destitute, and that the fear that communities, states would have to take care of these people. So those are the two main rationales to keep people out. The problem with this is that the states really don't have great mechanisms to keep people out. So there is, I don't want to say light enforcement, it's sort of periodic enforcement. When there's, public health outbreaks, then state officials will sort of crack down and quarantine immigrants and so forth. But by and large, even though this is a period of state regulation, it's generally considered a period of free immigration. Not completely free, not completely laissez-faire, because there still are these laws. But generally, you don't see the mechanism for a more restrictive policy. States have the laws. They occasionally will enforce them, sort of ebbs and flows. But by and large, people who come here, as long as they aren't incredibly sick or incredibly destitute, can land on the shores.
So something you wrote in this essay, I thought it was interesting and worth discussing, was there was a private enforcement aspect of these policies with regard to the shipping companies bringing immigrants over from the standpoint of these principles, paupers, fears of bringing over people who couldn't take care of themselves or who were diseased, and the shipping companies. For those who were placed in those categories and were not allowed in, would have to ferry them back across the sea, back to Europe, back to their destination, original starting point. And they didn't want to do that because it was at cost to them. And so they actually had their own sort of selective mechanisms, which I forget your exact data, but worked fairly well.
Yeah, that though you're going to see that beginning in the 1890s. So when the federal government takes control, one of the laws the federal government passes is they put the burden on the steamship companies. Because that's something the federal government could do that individual states would probably have a harder time to do. So once the federal government takes over, they put the burden, much of the burden, on steamship companies, and they'll fine the steamship companies for bringing over undesirable immigrants who get sent back. They'll fine them and put the burden of sending them back. So the steamship companies are also sort of regulating who they sell tickets to and who they bring over, which is also sort of a restricted category. It's we can talk more about this period beginning in the 1890s. But that's sort of the post-1891 period.
So I'm curious to get your thoughts in light of the Arizona decision and the majority opinion saying the federal government holds the field when it comes to immigration policy and makes a claim that this is just something that has to be true. It's historically true. And I gather, maybe just from reading this piece, you might disagree with that. Of course, Justice Scalia in a dissent disagreed with that. I even called it, there's an aspect of sovereignty here being taken away from the states. So, what did you make of that? How did you react to that? And I suppose we could say the Supreme Court for most of the 20th century, for 20th century history of immigration policy is correct, but it's not necessarily the case. I think that it has to be true that states couldn't somehow participate in it.
Right. It's kind of complicated, and the court's decision is a little tricky because the Constitution is largely silent on immigration, except for the power of naturalization.
So that would be the only. That would be the only part of the Constitution that even speaks to this.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the only part of the Constitution that really deals with immigration. So that's why up until the 1880s you have states running the show. But what really begins to turn it legally is this case in the 1870s, Henderson versus Mayor of New York, where the court basically says, without any really firm rationale, it's very much a pragmatic decision where they just say, listen, immigration has to be a national affair, and it's got to be something of the federal government. We can't have each state can't have their own immigration policy. It's after the Civil War. There's talk of unions and the union and the importance of the union, and there's kind of a nationalizing mood going on in the late 19th century. So the court basically says there's no constitutional principle. It's just sort of a dicta where they say immigration should be a federal matter, not left up to the individual states to create their own individual policies. And so that's really all of the subsequent decisions are sort of on that model. They're kind of built on that idea, which doesn't go back to the Constitution. It really goes back to the late 19th century. So I think you see some of that in Scalia's dissent, that idea that the grounding for this is not as firm constitutionally. It might be firm pragmatically. I think pragmatically, I think it makes much more sense to have one federal immigration policy than 50 individual ones. But in terms of constitutional matters, it comes out of this decision where they basically said, let's be realistic. The federal government should really take control of this. So the Arizona decision kind of shows, first of all, you see which I think it's part of a trend in the last 30, 40 years of kind of devolution to the states, more interest in state power, devolving some power back to the states. I don't think you would have seen this, Arizona doing this in the 1950s or even the 1960s or 70s. But there is kind of been a drive recently towards federalism, towards recognizing state authority and maybe sending some federal power back. So Arizona, decides to pass this law, which doesn't really contradict federal law, but it does. It's sort of problematic legally, because if you were to recognize that, you might open the door to other states, basically actually creating their own immigration laws. And I think that's what the Supreme Court wanted to sort of stop and say, listen, federal government preempts the states on this issue. And I think that's where we stand, and I don't think we're going to go back to a time where states make up their own immigration policies.
I want to ask you this question of the Henderson versus Mayor of New York case, which was really, it was a tax case, as opposed to states were charging immigrants certain taxes, I guess, to enter, and the Supreme Court wanted there should be a national tax uniform policy on that question. But also as the last quarter of the 19th century, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is as it sounds. Then there's the Alien Contract Labor Law, which is something like, traditional labor legislation, closed shop legislation, just applied to foreigners. American employers couldn't go abroad, I take it, and find workers and bring them here. I think
that's exactly right.
The question in my mind is this part of a progressivism story, or is it both a progressivism story and nationalized commerce and wanting to make things easier? I can see it kind of both ways, but it also, raises kind of the underbelly of using immigration policy to dictate economic outcomes that are not necessarily, free market, laissez-faire outcomes.
Yeah, no, I would say it's both. It's both both part of the nationalizing trend, and then a little bit later on, part of the kind of the progressive temper of the times. You're right. As soon as the federal government begins to get control over immigration laws, it passes the Chinese Exclusion Act and the contract labor laws. It's a weird period. The 1880s is a period where actually the federal government and the states share. It's like joint responsibility over immigration. So it's not until 1891 that the federal government finally says, listen, we're going to take complete control. But during this period, Congress passes these laws, which really they very much regulate. And, the Chinese Exclusion Act is obviously about race, but it's also about labor, just like the contract labor laws. It's about regulating foreign workers and the fear that businesses would simply have an unlimited pool of cheap labor to bring in and undermine the wages of native-born workers. And throughout the late 19th and the early 20th century, a lot of the progressive era rhetoric, sort of anti-business rhetoric, kind of creeps into the immigration laws. One of the big villains to immigration restrictionists were the shipping companies. The shipping companies were a classic big business who was looking out after their own financial interests to what these people thought were the detriment of the country, and therefore they had to be regulated. They just couldn't bring over whoever they wanted and then dump them off here. Similarly, big business often was strongest supporter of immigration for labor issues, and a lot of progressives were uneasy about that. They were uneasy about the motives of big business. So you kind of do see that progressive era breakdown with reformers who are concerned about kind of laissez-faire. On the other side, you have business who's interested in a free labor flow. So yeah, I think you see both the nationalizing and the progressive models at work here.
So the Immigration Act of 1891. So this begins the famous Ellis Island as a processing center.
Exactly.
Thinking Immigration Act of 1891. So, but would it still be fair to say, even with this legislation, the federal government has asserted some control here before that act, but now we've got the federal government really being the means of enforcement, providing kind of the necessary powers to get the job done. But even with that, immigration still flows pretty readily. There's nothing like an insistence on hard limits on who can come in. It's pretty open to what the market dictates.
Correct. With the exception of the Chinese, it is still yeah, it's still an incredibly free system of immigration. You're talking about after 1890s at Ellis Island, which is where 75% of immigrants come through. The percentage of immigrants turned away is less than 2%. Now you also.
I'm
Oh, go
sorry.
ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, we have to factor in the fact that some immigrants actually in Europe are not allowed to buy tickets because the steamship companies are concerned about bringing them over. So there's a restrictive aspect to that over there, so maybe the number is a little bit higher. But still, you're talking about 90+% of people who want to come over are able to get into the country.
And I think it was an interesting statistic. If I recall correctly, correct me, 1905, by 1905, 15% of Americans are foreign born. That was
Yeah, around, I always say 1910.
1910.
15,
Okay.
yeah,
That was
15% are foreign
that
born.
was fascinating. And the level of immigration, 1.5 million a year, if I recall correctly, in the first decade of the 20th century, which for comparable population growth from 2000 to 2005, I think you said would be like 4 million immigrants coming in every year, and I think we had 1.5 million during that latter period. So this was truly an impressive period overall.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, when you look at on the base of a much smaller population 100 years ago, a country that was one-fourth the size of what it is today, that wave of immigration up until the 1920s was very large on a smaller population. So today we're in a period of large-scale immigration, but in some ways, when you look at it as a sort of proportion, it's comparable to the period of 100 years ago.
Now things begin to change, and this kind of comes back, I think, to your original idea about politics and expectations shaping immigration policy, or the broader national story. So after World War I, we get an isolationist impulse for reasons. I mean, I don't entirely. I mean, obviously there's a racist element behind these national quotas. I think that's unavoidable. And then there's quotas after World War I based on country, and then there are overall caps as well. The isolationist impulse one can see just from the carnage of World War I and also the increasing radicalism in parts of Europe. I can kind of understand a fear there, but nevertheless, this is a departure made possible by political events.
Yeah, that's certainly true. That there is the laws that are passed in 1921 and 1924 would not have had the political support that they did in the 20s if it had been 10 years earlier, before World War I. And these laws in the 1920s are passed overwhelmingly. I mean, that's one thing. They're very restrictive, but they're also very popular. And I think World War I, as you said, the fear of radicalism, the isolationist tendency, even something like the influenza outbreak is something that really sort of sours Americans on it. The flu was called the Spanish influenza. It was seen as kind of a foreign invader. So it provides the ground for these kind of racialist thoughts where always there, the idea that Northern Europeans are superior to Southern Europeans and everybody else. And those ideas were always around, but it provides kind of a political impetus to say, okay, let's go ahead and enact that into law.
Now, how does policy shift or remain the same with the New Deal, the federal government, of course, taking on enormous new regulatory powers, but then also the post-World War II period? How should we look back? How do you think we should think about that period in immigration policy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a highly immigration from the 1920s to the 1960s is highly regulated. There are very strict quotas, overall quotas on the number of immigrants who can come in, and strict quotas on a nation-by-nation basis. And those are enforced strongly, and it's much, much harder to get into the country. That free flow of immigration is severely restricted. So, if you want to come into America, you first have to go to an American consulate in your country and figure out whether there's room in the quota that year. And if not, then you have to wait the next year.
So
there is one.
Go ahead.
Oh,
go ahead. I wanted to get you in on this and talking about the Bracero program.
Yeah,
guest
that's
worker
exactly
program,
what I was
and this seems to build in the exception for Mexico, for Central America, all of which continues to present day.
Exactly. Even though it is a highly restrictive sort of immigration policy, for the Western Hemisphere, it's just the opposite. The quotas do not cover the Western Hemisphere, Mexico, Central America, South America. And that creates a kind of exception. And what that allows is kind of a much freer form of flow of immigrants, not from Europe across the Atlantic or Asia across the Atlantic, but from Mexico, from the south north. And that allows programs like the Bracero programs or guest worker programs. There's a much kind of, I don't want to romanticize it, but there is a greater degree of migration from the south to the north during this period.
Okay, and then we get the 1965 Immigration Act, which was really, to the extent people reflect at all when thinking about immigration debates, or to the extent our kind of public rhetoric, the 65 Act is what everyone points toward with some justification. And this is a departure, and you write about this from past immigration policy. And the one point of departure, which is huge, is the family unification, but there as a guiding idea. But there's also these strict caps and quotas which continue, and that, of course, makes possible, or it seems to beg for illegal immigration, as you write about it.
Yeah, the 65 law was an incredibly important law because it really it changes the nature of who gets in and for what reason we allow people in. It does keep quotas, and as you mentioned, it extends the quota system to the Western Hemisphere. But what it does is it gets rid of the discriminatory quotas, so that England or Germany have a higher quota than other countries, and that's the tenor of the time. This is part of the Great Society, and it's also part of the kind of civil rights, even though we don't necessarily link immigration to civil rights. The idea by 1965 that you can sort of discriminate against people based on country of origin, that's all of a sudden, in the 64 Civil Rights Act, it says you can't do that. So Congress, no surprise, decides to go and revise the immigration laws, sort of get that out of the immigration laws. But the problem was that the quota laws were still pretty popular in America. There was not a great groundswell of support for changing the immigration laws. There was support in New York and other large cities, Chicago, from certain ethnic groups and their representatives, but there wasn't a big groundswell to change the laws. So what ended up happening is the way they sort of got this through was to kind of change the nature of who could come in and base it much more on the idea of family reunification. Because the idea was, family reunification is sort of a conservative thing, right? It's going to create stability. It'll be, the people who will come in, they'll basically be the relatives of people who are already here. And since immigration was highly restricted and, a lot of restricted towards Northern Europeans, that won't have such a disruptive effect. So what we have is a system now which is firmly based on family reunification. Some 2/3 of immigrants, roughly every year, come to America because they have a family member who's here, and that's the rationale for their entry into the country. And that has really kind of fueled and those are kind of most of the family people who come in through family reunification come in above the quotas. So people don't realize that we still have immigration quotas, but most of the immigrants who come in above the quotas. They're exempted from them. So it makes the quotas basically meaningless.
Through this principle of family unification.
Yes.
But then also as you're bringing over family members, they can become citizens, they can become naturalized, and then the process starts over again for them. That's right. I mean, they can now. Yeah. Well, that's
interesting. You can bring over you can bring over your spouse, obviously, but you can bring over brothers and sisters. They can bring over spouses, and you have sort of a large scale chain migration here.
Well, it seems. What's interesting there. It seems common sense would be spouse and your children come over once you're naturalized. But there's really not a lot of concern, it seems, with economics. And with using immigration to move, which seems, it just seems striking to me that's not really a guiding feature, but yet But now, there's also, of course, it seems to be this leading to illegal immigration with the quotas. And what do you do when America actually needs labor or finds the advantages to bringing in great labor, but it's got the quotas? And so, that's really largely, I mean, as people write, 1992 to 2007, that's been the big story in America. You write also there's a special relationship going on with Mexico. Higher quotas, if I remember correctly, for Mexico and other countries coming out of the '65 Act than other parts of the world. Am I wrong?
Quotas are the quotas are the same.
Oh, I thought it was like 220,000. Okay.
But before '65, there weren't any quotas.
There weren't any quotas.
Mexico. So what the '65 Act does is put Mexico and the rest of the Western Hemisphere under the same quota system as the rest of the world. But now all of a sudden there is an actual quota, and you lose that kind of free flow of immigration from the South, and the number of illegal immigrants, you can just see them skyrocket after 1965, and a lot of that has to do with the new restrictions put on Western Hemisphere immigrants. The other group, we often talk about illegal immigration associated with Mexicans, but there's another group that comes to the United States illegally in the 70s and 80s. That's the Irish. And it's kind of an irony. Ted Kennedy was the leading sponsor of the '65 Immigration Act, but unintended consequence, it had a severe effect on the Irish. It made coming to America even tougher for the Irish because they couldn't qualify for the small number of high-skilled jobs, and because Irish immigration had pretty much dried up in the previous 50 years, most people in Ireland didn't have direct relatives here in the United States. So there's all these unintended consequences, one of which is the rise of illegal immigration.
Ask you, so think about high-skill immigration. I mean, this is something a lot of people are talking about now, and this seems to kind of raise it. And I want to ask you a couple of questions, just current thinking, current principles behind what might be a way forward, because everyone seems to acknowledge that the present system is not working, albeit for different reasons. And I'm curious, a lot of people have written, Canada, Australia have these policies where their immigration systems are really tilted toward those with skills. Theory, they not only contribute to your economy, but can actually create wealth as entrepreneurs and contribute in a top-end way to businesses as managers, things like that. Ours isn't guided by that. We do have a lot of low-wage labor, and a lot of people would make the argument that at least in the short run, that's a net cost. So I'm curious what you think about those ideas. But also, I want to return to this idea of immigration happening within the bounds of national politics. So is it a decentralization idea going forward, or is it an increasingly centralized role? And I thought in this, I was thinking about something you said, that it's really impossible now to think of going back to the States. I suppose you're right, although one thing I wanted to throw in is thinking about kind of this cleavage that seems to have emerged in the past few years between the right-to-work states and the closed-shop states. Could one actually see those states wanting to have more open immigration and wanting to press for that and being more willing, I don't know, through various ways to welcome them in and wanting to get away from a single policy?
Yeah, although one of the problems would be a lot of the states that have open shop laws, right to work laws, probably also a lot of the residents of those states are probably culturally opposed to immigration.
That's a good point. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
So I think that you got two, and you see that in Georgia actually a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
Where that's why, for instance, Saxe Chambliss is generally kind of supports immigration reform. It's a southern state, and there's a lot of and immigration has caused a lot of cultural conflicts down there. But there's also a lot of businesses that rely on immigrant labor. So in some ways it's a centralizing force where our immigration system, the INS, and now it's ICE, has only grown. Immigration enforcement has grown, border patrols, and so forth. But I would say it's also contributed to kind of the disillusionment with the federal government and state power, because as you said, no one's really happy with the current system. And so we have this horrible irony that even though we have a large bureaucratic system with lots of government enforcement, it doesn't work very well. And I think that tends to undermine people's trust in government, whether they are immigrants or the children of immigrants on one side, or people who are concerned about large number of immigrants and concerned about illegal immigrants. So you sort of get it from both sides. And I think that's what you see today. People just, they lose faith in the system. They don't trust the system. So, we have a large government, and this is true not just in immigration policy, but in other aspects of public policy. You have a relatively large government, but one that people think doesn't work very well, and that tends to undermine the faith of the government, what the government does.
Thinking about immigration policy, seems to me one thing that some are, and some have articulated this for quite a while. But thinking of Jonathan Last's new book, What to Expect When No One's Expecting. I mean, it is the case that but for immigration, and this is really an economic story, we have a declining population in the last 30 years, I've read, but for the large presence of immigration, maybe other factors as well. It seems to me this is something we have to get right as a country, given a lot of other problems we have. We actually need a growing population, and we need that to work, and immigrants are a part of that. And they're also a part of economic vitality. A lot of the statistics of it, who becomes a millionaire, who's likely to start a small business, things like that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think immigration is an important aspect for economics. It's important for how we see the country. I think most Americans, even those who are not so crazy about immigration, kind of understand that immigration has played an important role in the country in the last 200 years. And that's why the interesting thing is no one is out there going, shut the gates.
Yeah.
To me, that's fascinating. And no one is saying shut the gates. But the most you'll see is someone like Pat Buchanan saying, well, we should have like a year or two moratorium on immigration. Let's a breather, a rest. But by and large, the issue that's attracted the most attention is the issue of illegal immigration. So you have some of the most vehement people who are against illegal immigration. Most of them generally don't say, oh, but let's also cut down on the 1 million legal immigrants we have every year. So it's a system that definitely we need to get right. But it's also hard to get immigration right because a lot of the factors that propel immigrants are out of our control. And it's we can regulate. This is the problem of regulation. Sure, we can regulate, but the world also has a way of throwing in things that regulators can't predict. We don't know where the next great wave of immigrants are going to come from, or why they're going to come. There's a theory that Mexican immigration is probably going to be on a decline.
Yeah.
You see declining birth rates in Mexico, a rising standard of living, a bigger middle class in Mexico. So it's probably it won't disappear, but it'll probably tail off. So, who knows what the next one would be. But you mentioned earlier Canada and Australia, and the way they look at immigration is somewhat different from the United States. We have our every year our legal visa system. Only about 20% are reserved for skilled workers. And the problem with some of the new proposals and discussions for immigration reform is they talk about adding more visas, but only marginally more. I mean, it's not going to fundamentally change the way we've kind of set up the system. And part of the problem is because when you have a family reunification system, it creates political incentives for immigrants and their children who are here to keep the system going. I mean, let's not forget, there's a great deal of support out there among immigrants, first, second generation Americans, to keep family reunification because they would like to bring over family members as well and keep that going. And that's sort of the downside to it, is that it sort of keeps itself going through this political support. But my own view is that I think we need to look more at sort of encouraging higher skilled immigrants, immigrants with some money who can create businesses, invest, and so forth, while still keeping the door open for refugees and asylees, but also for people to bring over family members, perhaps maybe not as broad as we have it today.
Some having the big sticking point is obviously those who are here in violation of laws. And of course, we've talked about how stringent those laws are, and there was an economic reality of us being willing to have so many come over because of the good things that it did economically for the country in the last 20 years. And thinking about this present problem, I think there are 11 million who would be in this category, and everyone is, the fear is, or what you hear is, no one wants amnesty. And so how do you get around that? And one proposal on the table is to create a permanent guest worker or non-citizen resident status for these individuals. Curious your thoughts on that. It seems, in just returning how America thinks about immigration, we've always wanted for them to lead to citizens, that it would lead to citizenship and full participation in the country, both economically, politically, in the community, socially, all of that. And it would seem to me, my question is, do you see that program as being a sharp departure or portending that?
Yeah, it would be somewhat of a departure. In terms of the issue of amnesty, one thing you have to remember is that and a lot of people don't realize, we've had policies, quote unquote amnesty policies, going back about 100 years in terms of immigration. There have always been ways for people who came here not legally to legalize themselves. The problem, I think, where we get to today is you can only have that kind of amnesty program under a more restrictive immigration setup, because then obviously that would encourage more people to come illegally. And I think that's what happened in the 1980s. You had, at that time, there were maybe 2 to 3 million illegal immigrants, and the 86 law, I think, legalized maybe about half of them. But because there was there's no increased enforcement, the issue of illegal immigration just sort of continued after that. And then now we're up to 10 to 15 million illegal immigrants. Whether to make them, I think making them sort of non-citizen permanent residents, so they're legally here but not able to become citizenship, I don't necessarily have a problem with that, because I think that would solve the problem of, quote-unquote, bringing people out of the shadows. Making them, if not full members of the political community, at least people who can, they can buy land, they can buy houses, they can, if God forbid, if they're a victim of a crime, they can go to the police and not fear things. All that takes care of all that problem. So that would certainly be a way around it, but I think the question is, how do we do this without having to then revisit the problem again 20 years from now when we still have a large illegal immigration problem?
I mean, in this regard too. Oh no, go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt you, but I was
no. Actually,
go ahead.
No. I'm done.
Thinking about that, interesting. If you could do a poll, how many would want to become citizens? I mean, it could be the case that a legalization process, you can participate in the life around you, come out of the shadows, as you said. But would a lot of those who are here now want to become naturalized? And I don't know, maybe it'd be the case that, half do, half don't. I don't know, a plurality do, and leave it at that. So maybe they would be comfortable with that. It does seem to me there's just something different or odd. I mean, I suppose their children would become naturalized citizens.
Well, that's true, yeah.
True, through birth. But I guess I don't know. Something about it I think is interesting or confusing to me. Thinking of going forward, I mean, do you think, are any of these things that we've been discussing likely to be featured in an immigration reform, or is it going to be something just a marginal muddling through, trying to just make a few deals and compromises, or is something comprehensive possible? And I suppose that maybe that's an unfair question, but.
No, I think what's going to happen, people they talk about comprehensive immigration reform. Well, none of this is really comprehensive. It's all tweaking the post-65 policy regime. None of it is going to fundamentally change the post-65 policy. It's just going to tweak it around the edges at best. Now, it might add, marginally more skilled worker visas. It might have this program of, a limited guest worker program. but none of it is going to fundamentally change. And that's the thing. We've had in the the late 1800s, the 1920s, 1965. Each of these immigration periods fundamentally changed what came before. They didn't. So they weren't tweaks. They weren't reforms. They fundamentally changed how America dealt with immigration. And I don't think any of these proposals will do that. They'll just sort of on the margins tweak it here and there. They'll provide some kind of amnesty for some illegal immigrants. Although my guess is if they do that, it'll be sort of administratively expanded over the years to include more people. No, I don't think I'm fairly pessimistic about the chances of any sort of real reforms or any real changes. I think we're just going to kind of muddle through. One of the problems is you have on one side people who are vehemently opposed to any kind of amnesty. Right? This is no amnesty. It's rewarding illegal behavior. On the other side, though, you have people who really don't want to change immigration laws at all. And I've seen this in various outlets where there'd be some very minor proposal to change some certain aspect of for instance, to maybe slightly restrict the family reunification. So that here's one example I remember. There was some plan that said, well, maybe we can cut off the age in which an immigrant can bring over a child. So let's say 21. Like you can't bring over if you have a child who's in their 30s, you can't bring them over in their late 20s. And I remember this woman who's involved in immigration policy was no, can't do that. You can't do that. There is, and that's sort of disheartening that there is a large number of Americans on one side who really basically don't want any immigration laws. I mean, I think that's sort of where it comes down to. And on the other hand, you have other people who are really so upset about the way the current law is, and made uncomfortable by the current immigrants that they don't really want any. They're unable to make any changes. And I think that's why you have these two groups on both sides, and that's why they can't come together and make any changes. And you have a Republican Party, which I think is just willing to. They just want to sign anything that says immigration reform, and then sort of be done with it and say, hey, look, we really like Hispanics, honestly, and I don't think that that's necessarily going to be anywhere, going to get them anywhere. But you really do need to move the system much more in favor of skilled workers, and you need to tighten up the family reunification. There's another aspect of the immigration law, which is the diversity lottery, which has come in recent times, where it's basically a lottery for people who don't qualify either for family reunification or for skilled workers. They usually come from countries that don't produce a lot of immigrants to America. It's kind of weird. It's kind of a weird. It's a random lottery for people, but. Yeah, it's very hard. It would be very hard to do away with that. So I don't see any chance for any sort of real meaningful reform. I mean, there might be some tweaks on the edges, something called amnesty, and but my guess is we would probably have to revisit amnesty sometime down the future. So yeah, politically, it's an odd issue, and immigration has always had strange bedfellows in terms of who's on what side. And one thing, there was an article, someone interviewed me for an article recently about organized labor, which was for a long, long time, in favor of immigration restrictions like the contract labor law, the Chinese exclusion. The AFL-CIO was always in favor of immigration restrictions, and now in recent years they've switched sides. And they're now in the
looking for new members, right?
They're looking for new members, yeah. And they it's not about steel mills or coal mines anymore. They're looking to organize the service sector and service workers, and many of them. And the other aspect of that story is that since probably now half of union members are in the public sector, they don't get competition from immigrant workers. Yeah. So in the past, organized labor, they were looking out to protect their, the coal miners and the steel mill, the factory workers from foreign competition. But today, more and more union members don't have any competition from immigrant labor because they work in the public sector. So
yeah, and indeed, that would increase your bargaining power And the public sector union, yeah, I mean that would make sense. That's interesting.
And also, I mean, put it even more cynically, create more clients for the public sector. If you're in the hospital field or education or what, I mean, obviously immigration causes problems in those areas, but and African Americans are the other group that for a long time were in favor of immigration restrictions. A. Philip Randolph, Booker T. Washington, and others. And today, the NAACP and other civil rights groups are now firmly in favor of free immigration.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, Professor Cannato, on this more pessimistic note, which I always enjoy pessimism, it keeps me going. I think we'll bring it to a close. I'm so glad that we could talk with you about our evolving immigration policy.
Well, thanks very much, Richard. I really enjoyed the talk.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.